A billionaire handed her credit card to a poor single father in the middle of a shopping mall and walked away. Less than an hour later, a transaction notification appeared on her phone. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't electronics. It wasn't an attempt to escape his life. It was something far quieter and far more devastating than she ever expected. Because in that moment, a man with nothing made a choice that would unravel everything she believed about poverty, generosity, and control. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. Elizabeth Reddick had spent decades mastering the art of certainty. At 41, she was the founder and CEO of one of the largest retail empires in the country, a woman whose instincts had turned collapsing brands into billion-dollar victories. Her name carried weight in boardrooms. Her decisions moved markets. From the outside, her life looked flawless. Designer clothes tailored to perfection. Private drivers. Homes that felt more like galleries than places meant to be lived in. Yet every success added another layer of distance between Elizabeth and the rest of the world. Wealth hadn't softened her, it had sealed her off. She believed struggle did something ugly to people. That desperation didn't reveal character, it erased it. She hadn't learned that belief in business school. It had been passed down, reinforced by experience, betrayal, and years of watching generosity turn into entitlement. That afternoon, she hadn't planned on stopping. She was cutting through the mall between meetings, mentally rearranging numbers and deadlines, when something slowed her steps. At a payment counter stood a man in worn clothes, his shoulders tight with exhaustion. In his arms, a little girl slept deeply, her cheek pressed against his chest, a small stuffed toy tucked under her chin. The man held a debit card in one hand and quietly removed items from the counter with the other, his movements careful, almost apologetic. He wasn't asking for help. He was trying not to be seen. When Elizabeth stepped forward and placed her card beside his, she didn't offer sympathy. She didn't explain herself. She didn't wait to see his reaction. She simply handed him access to everything she had and walked away. At the time, Elizabeth believed she was testing him. She didn't yet realize the test had already begun, and it wasn't his character on trial. Elizabeth didn't leave the mall. She repositioned herself near a fountain 2 levels up, angled behind a column where she could watch without being seen. Her phone rested in her palm, notifications enabled. Waiting. This wasn't kindness. It was data collection. Her father had taught her early, money doesn't lie. People do. But give them access to wealth, and their true nature surfaces faster than any conversation ever could. He'd proven it repeatedly. Employees who smiled through meetings, then embezzled. Charities that promised transformation, then vanished into administrative overhead. Even her ex-husband, who'd loved her right up until the prenuptial agreement became inconvenient. Every act of generosity she'd ever witnessed had been performative or transactional. Gratitude always curdled into entitlement. Always. So she'd learned to give strategically. Donations with stipulations. Investments with oversight. Generosity that maintained control. Wealth had become her insulation, not just from risk, but from disappointment. Success meant never being surprised. It also meant never being close to anyone. She told herself she preferred it that way. Now, watching the man below adjust his daughter's weight in his arms, Elizabeth felt the familiar detachment settle over her like armor. He would use the card. Of course he would. Desperation erased judgment. He'd buy something foolish, something that revealed what poverty did to priorities. And when he did, her worldview would hold. The experiment would conclude. She could return to her meetings, her empire, her certainty. But if he didn't, Elizabeth's grip tightened on her phone. If he didn't, then everything she'd built her life around would crack open. Every wall she'd constructed. Every reason she'd chosen isolation over intimacy. She wasn't testing him. She was protecting herself from the possibility that she'd been wrong all along. Jason stood outside the grocery store, the card heavy in his pocket like something borrowed he couldn't afford to break. His daughter stirred against his shoulder, her breath warm and even. He adjusted her carefully, then stared at the entrance as if it might swallow him whole. This wasn't his money. It wasn't a gift. It was a test he hadn't asked to take. He could feel the weight of invisible eyes, the certainty that someone somewhere was watching to see what kind of man he really was. The kind who took advantage. The kind who justified excess because the opportunity appeared. He wouldn't be that man. Not in front of Elysia. Not for anyone. Jason set rules before he entered. Only what she needs. Nothing he wouldn't buy with his own money if he had it. No indulgence. No shortcuts. Inside, he moved through the aisles methodically. Groceries first, generic brands, the same ones he always bought. He compared prices out of habit, even though the limit didn't exist. Pasta, rice, canned vegetables, bread that would last the week. He skipped the meat aisle entirely. Too expensive. Too much. In the children's section, he found clothes that were practical, not pretty. A size up so she could grow into them. Socks in multipacks. A winter coat marked down from last season. Then shoes. He knelt in the aisle, Elysia still asleep in one arm, and tested the soles with his thumb. Sturdy. Real support. The kind that wouldn't fall apart in 2 months. He added them to the cart. At the toy aisle, Elysia's stuffed bear slipped from her arms. Jason caught it mid-fall, and something in his chest tightened. She had so little. One worn toy she'd carried for years. He scanned the shelves, found a small stuffed rabbit on clearance, and placed it in the cart. Then removed a box of cereal he'd picked for himself. Even trade. At checkout, he watched the total climb and checked it against a mental list 3 times, despite knowing there was no limit. Because limits weren't about the card. They were about who he was when no one was watching. If you were the one in Jason's shoes, what would you have done with the credit card? Let us know in the comments. Elizabeth's phone vibrated. She pulled it from her purse, already composing the internal narrative. Electronics store. Maybe a pawn shop. Cash withdrawal. Something that would confirm what she already knew about desperation. The notification read, "Transaction approved, $127.43, Riverside Grocery." She stared at the screen. Groceries. Her thumb hovered over the details. Generic brands. Pasta. Canned goods. Bread. Children's vitamins. The list scrolled past like evidence she didn't want to see. Another alert. Transaction approved, $64.18, Little Steps Children's Apparel. Not designer. Not luxury. Practical clothing, marked clearance. Elizabeth stood and moved closer to the railing, her vantage point shifting. Below, she could see him through the store window, still holding his daughter, comparing price tags with the same careful attention she'd witnessed at the payment counter earlier. He placed something in the cart, removed something else. Her chest tightened. This wasn't the behavior of someone seizing opportunity. This was someone afraid of making a mistake. A third notification. Transaction approved, $31.50, WellCare Pharmacy. She watched him exit the pharmacy, a small bag tucked under his arm. Children's medicine. Nothing for himself. Elizabeth had built her entire philosophy on a simple premise. Give people access to wealth and their true nature surfaces. Greed. Entitlement. Impulse freed from consequence. But he wasn't taking. He was measuring. He wasn't indulging. He was surviving with precision. The certainty she'd carried for decades, the armor she'd built from betrayal and disappointment, cracked quietly, a hairline fracture she couldn't ignore. This wasn't proof of her worldview. It was a challenge to it. Confusion settled over her, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. She'd wanted him to fail. Not out of cruelty, but because his failure would have been easier. It would have allowed her to return to her life, her beliefs intact. Instead, she stood watching a man exercise restraint under circumstances designed to break it. And for the first time in years, Elizabeth felt something she'd trained herself to avoid. Shame, because the test hadn't been his to pass. It had been hers to survive, and she was already failing. The mall moved around Jason like a different world. Couples drifted past carrying branded bags, laughing over purchases they hadn't needed to think twice about. A teenager complained loudly into her phone about the wrong shade of sneakers. A clerk at the cosmetics counter called out promotions with rehearsed enthusiasm. Jason moved through it all like someone trying not to leave fingerprints. At the clothing store, a sales associate approached with a practiced smile. "Those jeans come in premium denim if you'd like to upgrade. Same price point, better quality." "These are fine," Jason said quietly. "Thank you. We also have a buy-2-get-1 promotion. Just these. Please." The associate's smile faltered, confused by someone turning down value. Jason paid and left, his daughter still asleep against his shoulder, her new shoes tied carefully to the outside of the shopping bag so they wouldn't wake her. From her position above, Elizabeth watched him stop outside a bookstore. He stood at the window for a long moment, gaze fixed on something inside. Then he turned and kept walking. He didn't go in. 20 minutes later, he returned to the payment counter where this had started. Elizabeth straightened, leaning forward slightly. Jason set down 2 unopened items, a scarf and a clearance jacket, and spoke to the clerk. She couldn't hear the exchange, but she saw the clerk process a return, saw Jason nod his thanks, saw him tuck the card back into his pocket. He was done. Not because the limit had been reached. Not because the stores had closed. Because he'd decided he was done. Elizabeth's phone buzzed with the return notification. The total sat far below what most people would consider excessive. Far below what she'd expected. He'd left value untouched. Not out of fear. Out of principle. The realization settled over her like cold water. This wasn't a test anymore. It was a mirror. And everything it reflected back, about control, about assumptions, about the distance she'd built between herself and the rest of humanity, made her want to look away. But she didn't. She couldn't. Elizabeth found him near the exit. Jason was adjusting the bags in one hand, balancing his daughter with the other, when he looked up and saw her standing 3 feet away. His entire body went rigid. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, the words tumbling out before she could speak. "I didn't, I thought." He shifted the bags awkwardly, reaching into his pocket for the card. His hands trembled slightly as he held it out to her. "I didn't know if there was a limit. I tried to be careful. I can return things if—" "Stop," Elizabeth said quietly. He didn't. The groceries were necessities. "The clothes, she grows so fast, and I couldn't," his voice cracked. "The medicine was for her cough. I didn't buy anything for myself except— No, I took that back. I returned 2 items because I thought maybe I'd gone too far, and I just— Please stop." Jason fell silent, still holding out the card like evidence of a crime he wasn't sure he'd committed. His daughter stirred against his shoulder, and he instinctively pulled her closer, protective even now. Elizabeth stared at him, at this man apologizing for surviving with dignity, for exercising restraint she'd never expected, for proving every assumption she'd built her life around was wrong. And something inside her broke. Not quietly. Not privately. Right there, in the middle of the mall, with strangers passing by and fluorescent lights overhead, Elizabeth felt tears slip down her face. She didn't wipe them away. Jason's expression shifted from panic to confusion. Did I? You didn't do anything wrong." Her voice came out unsteady, unfamiliar. "You did everything right." The control she'd spent decades perfecting dissolved. The power she'd wielded like armor evaporated. Because she'd been so certain. So convinced that desperation erased character, that poverty corrupted judgment, that giving without conditions only revealed the worst in people. But he hadn't been the risk. She had. She'd tested him to protect herself from the possibility that she'd been wrong all along, about generosity, about people, about the walls she'd built between herself and everyone else. And now those walls were cracking, and she was standing in the rubble, crying in public, while a stranger held out her credit card and apologized for being exactly the person she'd refused to believe existed. Elizabeth wiped her face with the back of her hand, composed herself, and met his eyes. "Keep the card," she said. "That's not why I'm here." Jason hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand. "Then why? I want to help. Actually help. Not test you. Not prove something to myself." She paused, searching for words that had never come easily. "I want to offer you something real." He waited, guarded but listening. "Housing assistance," Elizabeth said. "Not temporary shelter. A place you and your daughter can stay while you get steady footing. Job placement through my company's network. Something stable with benefits. Childcare support so you can work without worrying about her. And education, healthcare, whatever she needs." Jason's expression shifted, disbelief mixing with caution. "Why would you?" "No contracts," Elizabeth interrupted. "No publicity. No photo ops or testimonials. No strings attached." She held his gaze. "You don't owe me anything. Not gratitude. Not loyalty. Not your story." The mall moved around them, strangers passing without understanding what was unraveling between 2 people who'd been strangers an hour ago. Jason adjusted his daughter's weight, his jaw working as if testing the words before speaking them. "I don't want charity. This isn't charity." Elizabeth's voice was steady now, no longer shaking. "Charity is what I've been doing my whole life, giving at a distance, controlling outcomes, protecting myself from disappointment. This is just help. The kind you'd offer if you could." He looked down at his daughter, then back at Elizabeth. I'd have to think about it. Of course. I'd need details. In writing. I'll have everything sent to you. Jason nodded slowly, not with desperation, but with the same careful dignity he'd carried through every transaction. Thank you, he said quietly. Not for the card. For seeing me. Elizabeth felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but finally letting something out that had been sealed inside for decades. You made it impossible not to, she said. And for the first time in years, she meant exactly what she'd said. 6 months later, Jason stood in the doorway of a 2-bedroom apartment that didn't smell like mold or echo with someone else's arguments through thin walls. Alizia sat at a small table near the window, coloring carefully inside the lines of a library book. Her cough had disappeared. Her clothes fit. She had a bed that didn't fold up, toys that weren't secondhand, and a routine that included preschool 3 days a week. Jason had a job, warehouse logistics, steady hours, benefits that included healthcare. Not glamorous. Not a rescue fantasy. Just stable work that let him sleep at night without calculating which bill to skip. He still compared prices at the grocery store. Still bought generic when it made sense. But the edge of desperation had dulled, replaced by something quieter. The ability to plan beyond next week. Elizabeth visited occasionally. Not as a benefactor making rounds, but as someone checking in without fanfare. She'd learned to listen more than she spoke, to ask questions without expecting gratitude in return. Her life had shifted in ways her accountants couldn't quantify. She'd started visiting the programs she funded instead of just signing checks. Learned people's names. Heard their stories without treating them as data points. Boardrooms still respected her. Markets still responded to her decisions. But the distance she'd maintained for decades had narrowed, and she no longer felt the need to widen it. When Jason saw her at the door, he didn't flinch or apologize. He nodded, the same careful dignity intact. Coffee, he offered. Please. They sat at his small table while Alizia colored, the silence comfortable rather than weighted. No performance. No debt acknowledged or repaid. Just 2 people whose lives had intersected in a mall, both of them changed by a transaction that had never really been about money. She's doing well, Elizabeth said, watching Alizia. She is. Jason paused. So am I. Elizabeth nodded. Good. And she meant it, not because it validated her charity, but because it simply mattered that he was okay. Elizabeth found herself back at the mall months later, cutting through on her way to another meeting, another decision, another transaction that would move numbers on a screen. She stopped at the fountain where she'd watched Jason that day. The water still ran the same pattern. The stores still played the same ambient music. Strangers still moved past, carrying bags, checking phones, existing in parallel without intersection. But she saw it differently now. Wealth hadn't made her wise. It had made her blind. She'd spent decades believing money revealed truth, when really it had just insulated her from having to see it clearly. Control hadn't protected her, it had sealed her off. From risk, yes, but also from connection. From the possibility that people were more than their circumstances, that desperation didn't erase character, that dignity existed even when resources didn't. Jason hadn't needed saving. He'd needed support. There was a difference she'd never understood until she'd watched a man with nothing choose restraint over opportunity, principle over survival instinct. The tears she'd cried in this mall hadn't been about him. They'd been about her, about the decades she'd wasted maintaining distance, the relationships she'd avoided, the humanity she'd traded for certainty. He'd taught her what money was for. Not control. Not protection. Not proof of superiority. Just a tool. One that meant nothing without the wisdom to use it well. True generosity begins where control ends. Elizabeth watched a young couple near the payment counter, counting change carefully, deciding what to put back. A clerk waited patiently, no judgment visible. She didn't approach them, didn't test them, didn't position herself above or apart. She just watched, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than certainty. She felt possibility. The kind that only existed when you stopped trying to control the outcome and simply trusted that people, most people, were doing their best with what they had. And sometimes, the best thing wealth could do was step aside and let dignity speak for itself.